As a result of the Covid-19 pandemic, millions of people across the globe are seeing their livelihoods threatened. And in a fresh study, the International Labour Organization has warned that the impact on the world economy and the world labour market is going to eclipse the effects that we saw during the financial crisis just over a decade ago. The ILO is describing the situation as the worst global crisis since the Second World War. Well, for more, we can speak now to Guy Ryder, who is the Director General of the International Labour Organization, who joins us from Geneva. First of all, some people are clearly much more exposed to this resulting economic crisis than others. Just tell us first up, who's most at risk in your opinion?
Yes, you're right. The impact is somewhat unequal depending on where you stand in the labour market. In our report published today, we spotlight 4 sectors which are particularly hit. And I don't think you'll be surprised by them. It's about food and accommodation. It's about manufacturing and industry. It is about retail and wholesale, and it's about business administrative services. So these are the areas of activity which we think are on the sharp end of the employment impact.
And what are governments doing to soften the blow, and what more do they need to be doing, in your opinion?
Well, we have seen, I think, some quite remarkable interventions by governments individually. But let me say, notwithstanding the efforts that have been made, the ILO estimates for the next 3 months, for the second quarter of the year, are that we are going to see the loss of the equivalent of 195 million full-time jobs around the world. Let me repeat that, 195 million. These are figures we haven't seen in our living memory. So clearly, whatever is being done, we have to add to it. Now, what are governments doing? Well, we have seen, and they're catching the headlines, very considerable efforts made by governments individually to put fiscal stimulus into their economies, to accommodate monetary policies, and this is all very welcome. The problem is, of course, it's being done individually, country by country, and there is very little by way of global coordination involved. So that's one area of intervention. I think the second area of intervention is more targeted interventions to try to sustain enterprises. I think particularly, but not exclusively, of small and medium-sized enterprises, often viable concerns, but which don't have the reserves to get through the type of lockdown that they're subject to right now. And the other side of that sort of targeted intervention is to sustain wages, to put people on technical unemployment schemes with public financial support. And lastly, and it's equally critical, those people who are working, they need the right type of protection of their health and safety. We think, of course, of health workers in particular. But what about those people working in the supermarket? What about transport workers? There's a lot of people who remain at work, and they really do need to be looked after.
We are a French news channel, so forgive me if this next question is rather France-centric. But do you think that countries like France that have very supportive welfare systems and generous unemployment benefits are going to be better placed when we come out from the other side of the tunnel and economies start bouncing back? Do you think that's a factor?
I think it is absolutely the case that countries, and I think France is a good example, which have strong institutions of social protection, which have the types of schemes that can offer people technical unemployment, which enable them to retain the employment relationship, their connection with the labour market, even if they're not able to work today in a normal way. These are highly beneficial factors in responding to this pandemic for 2 reasons. One, it helps people to get through really tough times, and that's not a small thing. And secondly, and all the evidence of past crises would confirm this, once the moment of recovery comes, if people are still in the labour market, if people are still attached to their employer, the recovery is that much more rapid. The gradient of improvement comes that much more quickly. So I think France and other countries like France can take some sort of satisfaction in the fact that they have strong institutions, strong processes which will act to their advantage.
Right, and this is my last question to you, because we're nearly out of time. But I mean, okay, so there's going to be a bounce back at some point. We don't know when. But then there's going to be a huge amount of pent-up demand and a lot of catch-up, isn't there? Because people are going to buy the things they were always going to buy. They're going to go to the places they were planning to go to before the crisis. Doesn't that therefore mean that the situation is perhaps less bleak when we look at it on an annualized basis?
Well, maybe. And by the way, when the ILO talks about 195 million lost jobs in the next 3 months, we deliberately refrain from trying to say where we will be at the end of this year, for example, precisely for the reasons you're indicating. But, I wouldn't be quite as sanguine as you might make it seem, because I think the recovery is highly uncertain. The jury is very much out still on whether we can look forward to the V-shaped recovery, the quick climb back to something like normal, or whether it's going to be the L-shaped one, that long flat line before we finally get somewhere. Let's not forget in this crisis, supply is being hit, of course it is, but so is demand. This is a pandemic which acts on both sides of the economy. So the bounce back, I don't think, will necessarily be quite as vigorous or quite as automatic as we would all like to hope it will be. We'll have to see, but a lot depends on how quickly we get through this pandemic and what types of policies we put in place to deal with its economic and social consequences.
OK, well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Really interesting to speak to you. Guy Ryder, Director General of the International Labour Organization, thank you very much indeed.